like to hone in a little bit on. It seems to me that we as society tend to also kind of swing with the pendulum sometimes on kinds of issues. So while I appreciate and I think there are great things that are happening in our cities that are about a certain kind of pulse, almost like a daily pulse, the cities also have different clock speeds. And people, for example, in Europe are complaining that the government's too slow. I mean, look how long it's taking for the Eurozone to even agree on how to agree. But this is where I would push back, not on that issue, by the way, but on other things, is that sometimes it's actually good for the public sector to do things on a very slow pace, because certain things actually have very big timelines. And here we're talking about sometimes it's very boring stuff, like infrastructure. There's a whole parts of cities that are not visible to citizens, to the kind of daily pulse. But without addressing them and rendering them visible to the public, you are just passing on a problem. There are things like sewage, waste, all those kinds of things, which require huge investments, which are not necessarily always visible to people, but that tie that form of settlement to years to come. The other way to spin it is to say, as an architect, I get sometimes the kind of criticism, why don't architects do consumer behavior stuff? What kind of building would you like? Well, if you're doing a public building, like a public library, the whole idea of doing something public is that there is no single profile of a person. And in fact, if it's tied to 100 years, your so-called consumer may be very different. So there is a kind of, I think cities benefit from a kind of long-term clock speed stability and the combination of fast clock speed. So this is something I think that's quite interesting in how we manage that. The other thing I want to go back is this idea of being much more holistic, right, which I agree completely. But I think part of it is just even organizational, institutional. You were talking yesterday, for example, in Finland we have, I just bring Finland because it's easier to pick on things in one's own territory. But this is across the world, is why do we have a Ministry of Communication and Transportation? Well, because maybe in the 18th century when we were putting train lines, we also put phone lines, and it seems to make sense to bundle the world that way. Right? So now we have institutions that come from a world that it no longer exists. And yes, we can talk about working holistically, but they have internal incentives that are completely working against the desire to work across. And this, I think, is very challenging. So yes, we need to figure out the clock speeds, we have to figure out processes, we have to bring to inception to implementation, all the things. We also have to shape our institutions to support